All right, we are getting going here. Just waiting as everybody gets admitted. Um, I will start in just a second to introduce our speakers for today. All right, I think that everybody is in and connected. Okay, so if you don't know me, my name is Ryan Korstange, the treasurer here for the Society for Values in Higher Education. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you Kelly Hogan and Viji Sathy today. And they're going to speak with us about some inclusive practices for teaching. The way that this connects with what we've been doing this week, we've been talking this week about the future or futures for higher education in America. If we go back to Monday, we were talking about questions of access and structures that kind of prohibit and permit learning. And then yesterday, we spent some time thinking about kind of some fundamental tenets of learning that public higher education should promote or be based around. And today, what we have the opportunity to do is to think really specifically about ways that teaching and learning works so that everyone who's enrolled in classes can learn. I'm going to post a link into the chat right now with some information and a whole bunch of stuff that Kelly and Viji have written. They're both faculty members at UNC. Kelly Hogan is in the Department of Biology and Viji is in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience. They both teach big classes. And so, as you know, if you've taught big classes, dealing with all those mechanical features and all those people and making sure that everyone learns is challenging. So I'm really excited to learn from them today. So I'm going to turn it over to them and they will guide us through how we're using Zoom and kind of all of this stuff. So Kelly and Viji, thanks.
Thanks, Ryan. So I'm Kelly, and I just wanted to note, I don't know if you all have been doing this at all, but you can see that Viji and I both have our names, and then you can edit your names in Zoom, which is just something that's nice to do potentially when you're with a lot of folks that you may or may not know. You could add pronouns. Viji adds how to pronounce her name. Do you want to say anything about that, Viji?
Yeah, it's my name is unusual for lots of folks, at least in the United States. So I like to give as many cues as possible about how to pronounce. And in Zoom, it's really nice because I can sort of spell it phonetically. And then in other electronic forms, like in email signatures and things, I have an audio link. So you can click it and it's just me pronouncing my name. So giving people opportunities to practice hearing my name without needing to ask me to do it.
And as a teacher, I've always wished that our students, especially because I teach hundreds of introductory bio students, I always wished they had a little name tag floating above their head with everything. And so Zoom is actually a really nice platform. There are some benefits to being online. Alrighty. We are interested in knowing a little bit more about you. We're going to use a variety of technologies throughout this session to get to know you and to hear from all of you. So the first one is a poll that's asking who you are, and we have 4 choices here. So you can either go directly to pollev.com/Carolina on your computer, open another browser, or on your phone, or you can point your smartphone at this QR code, the camera app. You don't need to take a picture, just point the camera at it and it should take you there. Okay, and I can see that we've got 5 results in there, so I can see that it is working. Approximately how many people are in this webinar?
We've got 25 in the call right now.
Okay, that's helpful. So this is a tool that Viji and I both use in our classroom. It's great for any size classroom. It's obviously works well online as well. And it's a quick way to get information from everybody in the classroom. It's anonymous to the students in the classroom, but to the professor, it's not anonymous, so that students are registered and you can see who they are. All right, this is really helpful for us to know who we're talking to. a variety of folks, but certainly lots of educators who are going through what we're going through, which is teaching in the upcoming year. All right, we wanted to tell you a little bit more about us. Viji and I met, I guess, about 10 years ago, and at some point much later on in our friendship, colleagues into friendship, we were talking about college, and we recognized that neither one of us had ever raised our hand and spoke in college. 4 years. 4 years of going through school and never feeling comfortable to just do this and answer a question. And we were both good students and very engaged students. And so I think if you think about the typical characteristics of an introvert, we would both feel like we fit this list, especially if you look at this list of number 2 in a classroom. You're constantly in your head. Should I say this? Shouldn't I say this? Number 3, you really need some alone time to think without everybody else crowding your thoughts. And number 6, you have no desire to be the center of attention, which definitely inhibits the raising hand and jumping into a conversation or a discussion. So those things definitely fit us as students. Is it any wonder that people across this country might wonder, is introversion a personality disorder? Which is so sad, because close to 50% of the population probably identifies this way. But in education, we really traditionally reward extroverts. And we don't often talk about the strengths that introverts bring to learning and to a classroom. And so this is one of the lenses we bring to the classroom as teachers, to think about the strengths of introverts and how do we make sure everybody participates and we learn from everyone. So we'd like you to think a little bit more about students and the diversity that they bring to the classroom with another poll. So in what ways do students bring diversity? In what other ways in, say, a large classroom or any classroom? So you can submit one word, but you can submit multiple words. I'm just going to switch to a larger screen so we can look at it together. So this is a word cloud that's giving us a sense of the variety of answers that are out there. It's interesting, Viji, on the previous slide, there were some other answers there, weren't there? There we go.
Yeah, they're just loading slowly. That's all.
And typically in word cloud, the larger word means that at least more than one person said that. Great, so we'll give this a second to load a bit more, but we can see and we know that there are so many different ways people and students are diverse, right? And we want to be thinking about all of those students when we think about our classroom. So culture, experience, emotion. Okay. All right. Just make sure that you're on mute for now. Thanks. So one thing that is of note is that too often students and their diverse nature are blamed. So what do we mean by this? Here are some phrases we might hear uttered by faculty. After learning about how she studied, maybe this is a conversation after office hours, I'm not surprised she failed. It's clear those students don't even know how to write a sentence, let alone a paper with a coherent thesis. When I was in college, I didn't need outlines. Students need to toughen up. Students can't focus these days. Aside from a few in the front row, too many are on their laptops doing something other than my class. So this kind of student blaming and the diverse groups of students that are out there is a student deficit way of thinking. But we like to think about the definition of an inclusive classroom. And we think that this means that the instructor and the students move away from assumptions that some students are lacking and move toward the idea that learning environments and course designs lacking structure are a problem. So when we think about that, learning environments and course designs lacking structure, who's in charge of course designs and learning environments in any one course? I always point to me, and hopefully you're kind of thinking that if you're an educator as well, right? We're in charge of these things. So we want to move towards a course deficit thinking, okay? So away from a student deficit and towards a course deficit thinking. And because we're in charge of those things, it's empowering to think about the ways that we could make a change in our own classrooms or support others in their classrooms to move towards this thinking and about how to bring more structure. And that's a word that we really like, and we're going to continue to use today to talk about how we can make classrooms more inclusive by adding structure. When we think about an inclusive classroom, we kind of bin it into these two areas. One is course design, and the other is classroom environment. And in course design, what we mean are often the kinds of things we do to get ready for students before we even meet them. So lots of educators across the country are doing this right now, especially in this new online world. They're thinking about objectives for their class, they're building their syllabus, they're thinking about ways their students will practice, what kinds of practice they'll do, how many times they'll have practice and assessments, what the projects will look like. So the kinds of things that help a student learn, and we know that learning requires repeated practice. So when we think about a class with low structure, which might be a more traditional class where there is a lot of lecturing and very few opportunities for students to write or take quizzes, that might be a low structure classroom. And we have to ask who's being left behind by that kind of structure. Who doesn't know how learning works, which requires that repeated practice, right? So who comes without that know-how? And we want to avoid that where some students have the benefit of their experience to lean on and others don't know how learning works. So we want to build high structure into course design. The other area is the class environment. If all we do is use one mode of interacting with our students, perhaps it's a lecture with a couple of rhetorical or Socratic questions, we have to ask who's not being heard. And I told you already that Viji and I were two engaged students that were never heard with that kind of traditional classroom model. So in what other modes can we hear from our multilingual students who might not feel comfortable speaking up? From our students with learning differences, from our students who are underrepresented in any way in a classroom who aren't comfortable speaking up. We are in charge of those things, and we can provide opportunities to move away from models that don't allow for others to be heard.
Okay, so we want to give you a moment to think about some challenges we might have in supporting diverse students. I'd like first for you to have 1 minute to think silently to complete the following sentence in your head, or if you've got a piece of notebook paper beside you or somewhere where you could jot it down, that would be great. You don't need to put it in the chat window at this time. And the sentence is, I wish my students knew that one of the challenges I face supporting diverse students in a large classroom is... Okay, that was 1 minute. That might have seemed long, especially since we're all together. Sometimes the silence can feel really uncomfortable in a group setting, even virtually. So it's nice. I think it's important to remember that the silence is important in constructing ideas. And we are adding structure by saying we would like for you to think independently for a minute. And I set a timer because sometimes it is our tendency to rush this quiet time. So make sure that you have some way of keeping track of the time as you're monitoring for students. So now we're going to put you in a breakout room to discuss the thoughts that you had related to this challenge. I'd like for you to identify a reporter for your group. And this reporter will be the person who has the shortest first name. So introduce yourselves and figure out who that reporter might be. Take 5 to 7 minutes to exchange names and share your responses. When we come out of the breakout room, we're going to call on a few reporters at random to share 1 or 2 of the responses. You don't have to do everyone's response in the group, just pick 1 or 2 to share. And I'm going to paste these instructions into the chat window so that when you go to the breakout room, you'll be able to review them in the chat window. And again, the sentence is, I wish my students knew that one of the challenges I face supporting diverse students in a large classroom is. So the instructions are now in the chat window, and Kelly will put you into breakout rooms now. I'm setting the timer, Kelly.
We're not, I think we're not going to be there.
There's a few people that didn't get moved.
Those of us who joined through Whova do not have access to breakout rooms.
Oh.
Oh,
That's us.
that's us.
Well, feel
You're
free to talk
welcome.
amongst
Just
yourselves right
here.
here. Yeah, go ahead. Talk here. You're a breakout group right here.
My name is Amy. I suspect I have the shortest name.
We really need to do is go to Zoom.
Amy, would you like to share what you were thinking about in terms of your challenge?
Oh, I was thinking that I don't always have a way to have a complete understanding of what the students' needs are. So in a large classroom, I may not have a way of knowing what specific needs I should be emphasizing. I have a spectrum of needs that I do try to address universally, with the expectation there will be at least 1 or 2 students that would find them helpful. But there are sometimes where I just don't know. I don't know what I don't know is the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I don't know if there are others here. I know that sometimes people are listening in. If anyone else wants to chime in on a challenge that they face.
How much time to spend supporting the weaker students without turning off the ones who are doing the reading and pushing ahead with the subject actively.
Yeah, that kind of differentiation is always really difficult.
I don't know if I'm on or not. Nope, I'm not.
Yes. Lynn?
Oh, you are. Okay, just not my picture. I think it's some related to what was just said. It's how do I inspire, excite, get through to students who are in such different places. Um, if I'm in a small class, a seminar class, it's much easier. But in a large class, I don't know how you do it.
This is Amy again. It just occurred to me that from the perspective of I wish my students knew, I wish my students knew some of the things that I find challenging in the classroom. So I'm also an introvert. So standing in front of a large classroom is sometimes particularly intimidating for me. So figuring out how best to share what I find challenging to them, whether or not that might be useful to them or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I found, you know, I do share that with my students. It comes up in the context of some of the material we talk about, because I bring up introversion as one of those aspects we like to measure in psychology. And it's always surprising to them that I consider myself an introvert, given that this is the classroom I teach in. They often think I can't possibly speak to large groups of people without being an extrovert. So I think it's nice to be able to self-disclose some of those things in ways that shake up really their notions of who can do what in the world, and the idea that, you know, it's really possible to do lots of different things with practice and the right efforts. And so, yeah, I think it's nice to share those kinds of things when appropriate.
As an introvert, I agree we should share those things, but they don't come out naturally as often to just self-disclose. So sometimes I have to plan ahead. I want to say these things to the students. I might even write it down, you know, so we know it's valuable for students to hear this kind of talk from us that's not content driven, but it comes easier for some than others to just share.
Kelly, it's been 5 minutes.
Okay.
Am I on here?
Yes.
You are.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the video is different than I'm used to. I think mine overlaps a lot with what other people said, but I tend to think of teaching in terms of scaffolding. What can I do to help students do with my help that they can't do on their own? But the challenge, especially with large classes, is different students have different, you know, scaffolding that is best for them. So that's partly what they come in with, but also partly what forms of help they best respond to. I think sometimes people assume if they're not getting the help that they need, that maybe, you know, they don't recognize that just that challenge. You know, like when I used to teach a math course, the two most common suggestions were go faster and go slower. You know, it's hard to get it right without, you know, doing more individualistic forms of teaching.
Yeah.
I've heard those exact same words from Viji. She teaches statistics, so.
Yeah.
We're coming out of the chat.
Yes, I think you've all come back from your breakout rooms.
Yeah, sorry, I just dropped into your conversation.
No, it's okay. So just a reminder to mute yourself, because I know some of you were unmuted in your breakout rooms. So great. We are going to ask for some of the reporters to share, but before we do that, I actually wanted to point out a few things. One thing is, in the previous slide, you may have noticed that we had the instructions in an orange box. And so this is a technique that Kelly and I like to use, and you'll see it throughout this time that we're together, is the ability to really call out the instructions to you. And in this case, in a very visual way, this is a cue to our students. We use various colors. I think Kelly uses yellow and I use blue in my class, but they know when they see the screen and there's a big blue box, that's their turn. there's something up there for them to do. So it's a great way to give them a cue of the structure of the activity that they're going to be asked to do. The other thing is it's a really handy technique for me when I scan my entire slide set, for example. If I notice a big stretch where there are no blue boxes, then I know that I'm talking way too much, and there needs to be an opportunity for them to weigh in from time to time. So it's a really handy visual cue for that structure and the active learning that we would like to have in our courses. So a couple of other things we want to call out. You'll notice before we even began the breakout room, I moderated a 1 minute, and you saw me on my watch timing that 1 minute of silence. And you could probably suspect some of the reasons why, and we foreshadowed some of that with our discussion of our experience in classrooms. Does anybody have another reason why you might think that silent time might be important for a student? And you feel free to type in the chat window or unmute yourself and offer an answer.
Well, some students are not like me and don't think that as soon as the professor asks a question, they're ready to start talking. Obviously, I don't fit in that, or if I'm doing that here with colleagues, I was that student in the classroom too that was like, oh, I have an answer.
Yeah.
That's not everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. Yeah, and in fact, I mean, we know, and you know, my background is in psychology and neuroscience. There's actually a survey, and I keep trying to dig up the exact question, but when I read the question, I realized, wait, other people have to practice what they're going to say before they say it out loud. I didn't even realize this was something that that occurred, and I thought it was just me and the way that I worked. And so I think it's helpful to remember that time is important, not just for formulating the idea, but really leveling the playing field in terms of everybody's ability to sort of think through their response, not just the person who feels brave to throw up their hand and maybe even just be willing to wing something in the moment. That's not what we want to encourage or reward. We really want everyone to be able to speak and to have the time to think about their response. And then you'll notice too in our instructions, we asked you to exchange names. Now, some of you may know each other from previous sessions, but it's not something that we can assume. So we wanted to make sure that you had the opportunity to learn about one another. We assigned a reporter, in this case by the number of characters in your first name, but it could be anything. And we use a variety of these kinds of prompts for assigning reporters in our classroom as a way to build community too, right? So I could say your hometown, whoever's hometown is the farthest away, for example, or who's the last person who had pizza in the group. So there are ways in which students can learn from one another in this structured group activity that allow for a little bit of outside content discussion before diving into the discussion. So thank you for letting us model some of those, and we just wanted to point them out explicitly as we were going along. So now, if you were a reporter in your breakout room, if you wouldn't mind typing your name into the chat window so we'll know who the reporters were for the groups. Great. Okay, so I see a list of names here. So I would like to call on one or two of you to share some ideas that came up in your group. And again, we're going to impose a little structure here. You're going to have about 30 seconds or less to just quickly tell us a couple of ideas that came out of your group. So I'm going to take a look in the list here, and I'm going to go with Ren. Ren, could you unmute yourself and share a couple of ideas in 30 seconds or less that came up in your breakout room?
Sure. We had time, knowledge, cultural issues, for example, foreign accents, sharing interests that may not be giving students enough time for their own process of discovery, impatience, and let me see. Our instructional designs may be too narrow, focusing on small answers when our students are hungering for larger answers and issues.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Joe, could you unmute yourself and share just a couple of ideas that came up in your group, 30 seconds or less?
okay. Only 2 of our group of 4 have had experience with large groups, but both of them, the ones who had, agreed that connecting with students individually was an issue with large class sizes, whereas some classrooms support that with infrastructure, and sometimes you could leverage classroom space to promote interaction either between students or between students and faculty. It still remained an issue, just trying to connect with the students individually.
Great, thank you. It's interesting that you couch it in terms of the size of the class. I think this is a common sentiment that comes up with large classes, that it's harder to do. But I would argue too that in small classes, it doesn't necessarily imply that there's inclusion or inclusive techniques applied in a small class. It might feel easier to get to know your students and understand where some of the challenges are, but it is something that would apply to any size classroom as we're thinking about building structure, regardless of the discipline that we're in or the size of the class that we're in. Great.
Okay, this exercise was one that we actually held on our campus at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And we asked faculty the same question that we just asked you. And certainly some of the things you said came up. Some other things that we noted that faculty felt were challenges were not feeling confident about managing challenging or hot moment conversations. So what do you do in those small moments of chaos, right? And do you feel prepared? Sometimes we heard from others that diversity issues are outside the scope of their course. We're both in the natural sciences, and so we hear this a lot from some of our science colleagues about, well, I don't need to cover that. My humanities colleagues cover those kinds of things, right? Those are just a few in addition to the challenges that you all mentioned as well. And then in the course of this large campus conversation, we also had students answer a parallel question along these lines. And the goal was really to be listening to each other, to talk about how diversity is not only a strength, but also can be a challenge, and we need to listen to each other to see where we're struggling. And so we asked the students to say, I wish my professor knew that I feel included when blank, and I don't feel included when blank. And I'll share with you a summary of some of those answers because I think they apply to students anywhere. So we grouped some of these into participation issues. And the students said, I don't feel included when. The professor says, talk to a neighbor, but the neighbor has other friends and I'm left isolated. So this can happen a lot in an active learning classroom. And of course, we've really been touting, get students talking to each other, collaborating, active learning. But that doesn't mean active learning is always inclusive, right? So here's an example where a student continually felt isolated. They let students pick their own groups because I usually don't know many people in the class. So once again, this feeling of feeling excluded, even though the professor is probably trying to use these active inclusive methods. My grade depends on speaking out in class because this makes me feel like I do not belong or I'm somehow doing something wrong by being shy or introverted. Of course, we've talked about some of those issues already from our own lens as students way back when. Participation grades are only given to those who speak to the class, right? So this comes back to this extroversion being rewarded. When an entire class goes by and I haven't had the chance to speak, even if it's just working with a neighbor. So this can happen in a lecture-only class, but it can also happen in other formats. And it probably speaks to the opportunity that some of our students have had to be in a variety of classrooms where they have had feelings of greater participation. And when they know it's not there, they have an experience they can call on where they felt more included. This is a big one, and it certainly applies to classrooms and meetings and everywhere in our world. Faculty let certain students hijack or dominate class discussions. And so this really speaks to the idea that many faculty were not trained in teaching in higher ed, let alone how to facilitate a conversation well, right? And our students feel that. A lot came up around lecture style. Students don't feel included when the classroom is solely lecture style with no room for questions and sharing of ideas. They're engaged and they want to be participants. All the professor does is talk. It's often the case where the professor only talks and goes through the lecture slides. This makes me feel like the learning aspect is not important. And I find this to be a really insightful answer from a student, that they know the learning requires more than listening, right? And that's not something every student actually knows. The class lectures are regurgitating the textbook, right? So what is the value of being in a classroom, interacting, whether that's asynchronously online or in a classroom? Maybe the value isn't there for students when it's just regurgitating content. On the flip side, they did feel included around participation when they're allowed to ask questions to classmates without interrupting a lecture, which means even if faculty just took a minute of silence and said, okay, I'm going to stop talking for a little while. Why don't you all talk to each other, see what has come up in your understanding? What questions do you have for each other or for me? When I have a time to think before I respond to a question or a comment, when I have the opportunity to participate without talking, these are some of the things we have talked about already. And another big bucket was about instructor care. They felt included when I have the chance to interact with my professor outside of class. When a professor recognizes me outside of the classroom, that's a nice feeling. When pronouns are asked and respected. When my professor makes eye contact and asks direct questions to me. This may seem like such a low bar, but for students to mention it, and it came up a lot, we know that, especially in larger classrooms, not all students are feeling more than just a number and a seat. My professor takes the time to learn my name, right? And so, like we said, Zoom makes it easy to learn names, but in a classroom face-to-face, you have to make other efforts. That might be putting name cards out or taking extra time to learn and memorize who's sitting in what seats. And there's no one right way to do it, but it does show care to make the effort to do it. So coming back to the inclusive classroom, having these two components, we've got the course design and the class environment, and we really need to focus on both for learning to occur. But the good news is that when both of these are structured, and we think more about the design and the repetition of learning, and we think more about how we interact with our students, our own research and others has shown really significant impact for our students, not just in what they think and what they tell us they care about, but we've both seen achievement gaps closing in our own classrooms, and this has been replicated in lots of different classrooms. There's increased learning that takes place. There's a greater sense of community and sense of belonging, and definitely a greater sense of interest in the discipline and motivation for learning that discipline. So all of this to say that these are things that any one instructor can do, and any one instructor can feel empowered to do to make a difference, to have all those different things impact students around learning. And especially when we think about the differences that we know exist, these inequities that exist, we can close some of those inequities, even one instructor at a time. That's not to say that should be the only solution, but one instructor can make a difference.
So we wanted to just think about some of the principles related to inclusive teaching and ask you to wrestle with a couple of scenarios in a moment. But one of the principles that we talk about with inclusive teaching is that it is a mindset. So for every decision that you make, asking yourself who is being left out as a result of that approach. So when we were transitioning in the spring, Kelly and I were having lots of discussions about what we would do with our courses. And I ended up going synchronous with my students, and Kelly asynchronous, but we had a lot of really rich discussions around the inclusive aspect of these different approaches. And I felt for my own course and the way things had been structured up to that point, that it was really helpful to go synchronous for the people who could make it, but then I recorded the session and made it available to those who couldn't make it. And because we have lots of polls that we do in class, I made those polls available asynchronously as well. So I called it sync with an async option. But I think this is something that as we move forward, thinking about, you know, any decision we make, there is a result of that decision, and you want to make sure you minimize the negative impacts that might occur as a result of that. And so that's a simple one. If it's helpful for students to meet synchronously, to make sure that there's an option for students who cannot meet synchronously to participate.
The second principle is the more structure, the better for all students. So the way we think about that is that adding more structure works for all students, but it won't harm the students that don't need that particular structure. Our own experience tells us that students generally thrive from structure. So they sometimes call it organization, but everybody likes organization and all students really thrive from it, but some really disproportionately thrive from it. And so that's a good thing. So for example, if I'm online teaching and I'm asking students to watch a video, or if I'm face-to-face and I'm giving a mini lecture, I would expect students to be taking notes for themselves, but not all students come from a know-how, right? A background in which they know exactly how to take the best notes. And so what I do is I provide them skeleton outlines, which provide just a little level of organization and leave lots of blanks and areas for them to fill in. And it provides them this overview of how I'm thinking about it, but still gives them an ability to learn how to take notes. And so it certainly doesn't harm those students that come from a background where they've had lots of instruction around how to take the best notes, but it really helps the students that don't have that know-how. And as an added benefit, it really helps multilingual learners. It really helps students with learning differences and so on, right? So the idea that the structure is good for all, it won't harm those that don't need it, and it can be really a disproportionate benefit for some.
And the third and final principle is that too little structure leaves too many students behind. I know that as we moved online, or some of you who have taught online courses know, when you provide video content, just because you provide it doesn't mean that they'll actually use it, right? So you could create the greatest resources and post them, but it's not helpful if the students aren't actually engaging with it or keeping up with it. So if you've got an exam coming up or a paper coming up and you go and check and see, wait, only a certain number of students have accessed those materials, it can feel disheartening to do that. And I know that I had this experience early on in my teaching when I made study guides for my exams, and I posted them on the learning management system. And then I went to look, and I was so proud of how great these study guides were. And then I went to look at the access numbers, and I was just disappointed that not every student had taken advantage of those study guides. And then it occurred to me that that wasn't an inclusive practice. The better practice would be to make it an assignment before the exam in which all students engaged with the study guide if I felt it was truly helpful for the exam. So that taking away that option feature and making it a more of a required feature in the course made it more inclusive. So that structure is really important. And I know that it sometimes feels at odds with the way we teach and the way we think about teaching and learning. But I want to push you all to be thinking about, by not imposing structure, you're really relying very heavily on the students to know what is important to do by way of their own learning. And that structure is very helpful for students who are still developing in terms of how they think about how to study and how to prepare best for their courses. So it won't hurt the students who don't need it, but it will definitely help the students who could benefit from it.
Yeah, and to add another example with an online learning example, the discussion board of my classroom has always sort of been a bit optional, but now we know, leaning on online classes, we're going to have to create community, and that's going to have to come through asynchronous discussions through these discussion boards and posts. And so one of our colleagues that we follow, she's the author of a book called Small Teaching Online. Her name is Flower Darby. She also echoes a lot of the same ideas with online teaching, that you need the structure. And so the idea is that you can't just put a discussion post up there and expect students know that they should post a few times and they should reply a certain number of times. So add the structure, tell them, this is not optional. You each have to have one post by this time. You need to have so many replies by this date. I expect this kind of comment. You might need citations, you might not, but all of that to say that not leaving it optional and providing that structure helps everyone. And the purpose here is community building, which is going to be really important in the next year.
So
Okay.
we wanted to give you a couple scenarios to think through. There are two scenarios, but we're going to ask you to just focus on one, and we'll put you in a breakout room to focus on that one. These instructions, like the last ones, will be pasted in the chat window for you to be able to access. So in your breakout room, if you're in an odd number team, you're going to focus on scenario A, and if you're an even number team, you're going to focus on scenario B. We will ask you to appoint a scribe in your group because not everybody may have access to the Google Doc, which there is a QR code, and I know some of you had trouble getting your phone to actually point to the website. Don't worry about it. In the chat window, there will be a link that you can directly click to get to the Google Doc, and as well as these instructions. So we'd like for you to read the scenario that you've been assigned to, discuss strategies in your group, and then you'll have an area below on the second page actually to log some of the thoughts that you have related to strategies for that professor in the scenario. I'm going to give you about 5 to 7 minutes, and we'll check and see if that seems like about the right amount of time as we go through, or if you need a little bit more time. So just a reminder, in the chat window, you'll see these instructions that are in the orange box pasted in, as well as the Google Doc link that will take you to the scenarios and a space for you to log your work. Are there any questions before going to the breakout room? Okay, see you in a bit.
So the folks that are here who can't join breakout rooms, we can assign you as a group together. Why don't you take scenario A on the Google Doc and then just unmute yourselves and use this as an opportunity to talk together.
That thing doesn't do anything. Can you tell us about how many of us are here?
Oh, sure. I didn't know what you can and can't see. So I see a few names. I see Tom, Lynn, Jay, Hoover, Amy Berger, and Melly Howard. So 5.
I don't see the code for the Google Doc in the chat.
I have the Google Doc open if you'd like me to read the scenario.
Okay.
So a 10-page research paper is due at the end of the semester. The professor has 2 activities to prepare students for the paper. First, they bring a librarian into class one day to learn about gathering sources. Next, the professor has an assignment in which students produce a bibliography. At the end of the semester, the professor only finds 2 papers they think are excellent, and they are disappointed in most. And the prompt is, how can the professor structure this to ensure more success from all students with varied experiences and backgrounds?
Are we unmuted?
We're unmuted. I think the professor can create additional checkpoints where they have to come up with an outline or they have to come up with a chapter.
Tell you which sources they're going to use. Say, name 5 of the sources that you plan to use and write them in the proper, whatever bibliographic form he or the university has told him to use. And so that they, he knows for sure they really know what that means, and make sure that maybe if they could have that orientation with the librarian in the library or a second one or something, maybe he could go with them at some point. I don't know how big this class is, but anyway, and say, okay, this is what the librarian was talking about here. This is where you go to do this. And, this is what you do to do that, because otherwise they might make the connection between his words and the actual library.
I think also that it's helpful if the students recognize what the professor's expectations are. And so providing an example of what might be considered to be an outstanding part of a paper and what a part of a paper might need help. I've had some success with running sort of little writing workshops where I provide draft versions of a paper with names from completely removed, and sometimes I make them up myself, where we go through and we start looking for things that are that could be changed or edited, and so it's just short sections, and so they have a much better idea of what the expectations are.
It's a good idea. I used to have to do, had my students do a copy of they could hand it in. It was supposed to be kind of like the final copy, but they would have a chance to rewrite it if they wanted to. And all of them, more or less required to rewrite it. But I mean, if they didn't, then they got stuck with what they'd written the first time. And I found that to be very useful. But of course, if your class is huge, you really can't take the time to do that. But I had smaller classes for those seminars, and there really was a big improvement. I discovered that in spite of all my wonderful ideas that I thought I had explained carefully, how to do the footnotes and the bibliography and the maps and all this sort of thing, there were large spaces that they had not understood on the first try. And it wasn't by laziness. You could tell that they thought they were doing it right, but they missed it. A lot of times they couldn't tell the difference between the publisher and the author, for instance, of the book. Well, I had not thought to, try to explain that or to give a lot of examples of that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. I'm still trying to figure out how best to make it work, but I think peer editing is a really valuable tool also, particularly when the classes are a little bit larger. But it takes a lot of community building before effective peer editing can be implemented.
Right.
One thing that I like about peer editing is I can have peer editors working on slightly different things. So say a student is editing 2 different papers of their peers, names stripped off, and in one paper they're looking solely for whether or not there is a clear organizational structure from the beginning of the paper to the end. I teach science, so organizational structure is really important also. And then another student might look to see if there's appropriate citations listed within the text and the bibliography. And so not every student is looking at the same thing, but they all have goals of that they're looking, or things that they're looking for, in which case I think that helps to internalize the things that they feel that they need to put into their own, or they recognize the things that they need to put in their own papers as well.
Does it make a difference whether the students know each other before the course or not? We were teaching in a situation where the students had been together for multiple years with the same group of students. It was like elementary school. And so they knew each other very well, and nothing was anonymous. I'm wondering how that would affect peer editing.
I think your idea of doing specific things that they're looking for is helpful. And that would cut out a little bit of that I'm better than you are, or sort of idea. Just checking for a specific thing, just sort of proofreading for them, checking. That's a good idea.
The other thing I've done when I have students that know each other really well, and at some level, you know, they know each other well enough that they're going to recognize, you know, one style of writing from another, but is to not have them read the whole paper, but to have students essentially submit a part. Like they're going to submit the section that they feel like they need the most work on. So maybe it's the results section of their paper, maybe it's the abstract section of their paper, maybe it's their site description section of the paper. And so each person is only looking at a very, very small part of a paper. And I like doing this. I don't actually get to students reviewing each other's papers until we've done a bunch of papers that weren't written by anyone in the classroom. But I think it's helpful once we get to the point where I'm asking students to submit the part of the paper they feel needs the most help. And so they take a look at these. It's not like, okay, this is everybody's best work. This is everybody's worst work. And I like it because it takes a little bit of pressure off to say, okay, well, you know, I'm going to submit something and it's not going to need any revision at all, which is, of course, is, you know, nobody ever needs no revision at all. But if the expectation is that revision will occur, then it helps a little bit.
Is this a specific paper writing course, or is this a content course where the?
No, it's a content course.
Part of it.
Yeah, I do this in all of my upper level content courses.
Okay, right. Our nephew is teaching a scientific writing course this year, and so that's the main thing he's trying to help them do is figure out how to write the papers.
Yeah, I wish we had enough staff and time and faculty to have a specific paper writing course, but we just don't.
He's doing a postdoc.
Sorry to interrupt, but I'm in a group that I need to go back to because we were not able to access the Google Doc because it did not show up in our chat.
Okay.
And the pop-up is not something that we can click on.
In the Google Doc?
It is too long to type out. It is not up long enough.
Huh.
So we've now spent 5 minutes waiting for something.
Okay. Were you in group 3 or were you in?
I think so. Dan and Ren and Eric.
Okay. It won't let me do that. I'm going to send you to group 2 for a second and then I'll move you again.
Okay.
Doesn't seem to want to be moving you, Judy. Viji, what do you think? Maybe I'm just going to close the breakout rooms and come back because I think there have been, for some reason.
Well, we did nothing.
That's okay. It's okay. We'll discuss the scenarios and.
We talked about how difficult it is to, we talked about learning about sympathy for students who are not given enough instruction.
How can the professor structure this to?
Yeah.
For me.
Dan, I emailed it to you, but obviously.
Oh, look, here we are.
Are we back at the big group now?
We see
you.
I'm confused.
We are, yes, Danny.
Okay.
All right, thanks for coming back. I know that some of the groups had a little difficulty. My apologies. I had pasted this into the chat, but I didn't realize that it was only sent to one person rather than the whole group. And so I repasted it in to everyone. So I know that a few of you were able to get into this, but this is part of our learning experience here is that people are also not necessarily on Zoom. And so we have to think through access to the material, even if you can't click the link.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I was on Zoom. So that's not a inside.
Yeah,
and
yeah, so there are certain things that about the functionality of Zoom that we're also figuring out too. So I know that it was a challenge to get to the Google Doc for some of you, but we did hear from some. So let's just talk through the scenarios that we had here. And then if ideas come to you as we're discussing, feel free to chime in and share what strategies you might have as well. So the first scenario that we asked people to think about was the scenario in which there's a research paper due at the end of the semester, and the professor has a couple of activities to prepare students for the paper. First, they bring a librarian into class one day to learn about gathering sources, and next the professor has an assignment in which students produce a bibliography. At the end of the semester, the professor only finds 2 papers they think are excellent, and they're disappointed in most. So if for any of the groups that talked about scenario A, I'm just going to ask you to unmute and maybe just tell us your name or wave your hand and say, I'd like to be called on. If you could think through or tell us like a couple of the ideas that came to mind for scenario A to provide a little bit more structure for the professor and the students. I see a hand up, and I'm sorry, I don't know, I can't tell what your first name is, but it's reading as F. Tolhurst.
Yeah, it's Fiona. Sorry. I was supposed to be in scenario A, but we never got access to the link. But what I would say to this situation is I always, when I have a paper, I do a thesis statement phase and an outline phase and a draft phase. So I do a lot less work on bibliography and more focus on just making sure each student has an argument. So.
Yeah,
Right.
so that's great scaffolding.
Yep, exactly.
I actually do something really similar to this and have had exactly this problem and have found it gets better with like several things. One is giving them examples, trying to kind of, as has been mentioned earlier, make the expectations more specific. Like, I want you to have at least 5 papers that relate to your research study and describe how they're related or why they're related. Like, just adding specificity to it helps. And then giving them a chance for an iterative feedback steps where we look at it, we give them feedback, and they can fix it also helps too, because, you know, then they have another shot if it's if it's not like where we want it to be.
Sure. Good. Yeah. So that's a lot of great structure to add in the scenario. And this is actually something I experienced as well, in that the idea of giving sample papers is really helpful, because some students might like to see it. What does an A paper look like? What does a B paper look like? Along with a rubric, right? So oftentimes we're using rubrics to grade, but we don't necessarily provide the rubric to students, but we should, because that's what they're being held to. So it's nice to be able to say, in order for it to have, you know, to have reached these benchmarks, these are the kinds of things we're looking for, that there are 5 citations, for example, however it is that you've structured it. But it gives students the opportunity to really understand what it is you expect of them. And it's helpful to be able to provide that structure, not just for them to have some better understanding, but for you to see that they are able to incorporate those techniques in the paper as the semester goes along, and not waiting till the very end to learn that they maybe aren't going to make the mark, for example.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think there's this elitism sometimes that goes along with being a professor, that like students should just know how to do this already, right? But even in our own professional writing, we go through lots of iterations and we get lots of feedback, and we need to model that for our students and not blame them, right? Which is where we started with this idea of blaming students for the differences that they bring to our classroom.
Also, I would like to point out that students that we inherit in our classes do not know the difference between a search engine and a database. And so that's why it's so important to have a librarian come and perhaps assist students in thinking about research in different ways. Also, they've come from high schools that have cookie cutter ways of approaching a paper. And we need to say, no, your curiosity needs to be unleashed, and you need to bring a different set of questions, a different set of eyes to the process of what it means to do research. You're permitted to do that. You do not have to fit the high school cookie cutter model of what it means to write a paper. And I think it's the professor is duty bound to suggest. I have one-page sets of questions that you might bring to the task that I'm asking you to do, so that you can begin to see how to frame your questions and to follow those questions wherever they may lead.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think it's also helpful to go one step further to say, as somebody who is an educator who's seen many types of papers in many years, what the pitfalls are, where you see that students often fall into traps, and to just get them before they get to those traps to say, this is something that I often see happens as you get started. And I want to preemptively get out there and tell you, you know, this is not the way to approach it. This is a better way to approach it. So really thinking through these sort of frequently asked questions, but a different version where it's structured, where it's, you're not hiding the rules or the principles that you want them to espouse. You're really just shining a light on it and saying, this is what's good writing and what we want to encourage.
Looks like Dan has his hand raised, and then after Dan, Phil.
Well, what I was thinking has already been mentioned, the idea of offering people some examples of what a good paper looks like, but maybe also teaching students how to read papers, how to evaluate them, may give them a better sense of how to write better themselves. So maybe have a session which you sit around and talk about what a good paper looks like and have them evaluate other people's work.
That's great. Yeah, and I would add, it's really important in this scenario to not expect that the students would be able to apply a rubric that you designed to another student's paper, rather focusing on maybe broad questions that they might be able to address by reading. So if you swap papers in a class or swap a section of a paper, that maybe they're just giving feedback about where there's clarity, where there's a lack of clarity, how they might strengthen to fit the rubric a little bit better, but they're not being asked to think about what the grade might be or how the rubric might be applied to that paper without at least a good amount of training from you. And Kent, you have your hand up.
I think Phil had a question.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Phil is muted.
Phil and then Kent.
Okay, yeah, the only point I wanted to make too, I think that we need to show some extra compassion, particularly with our undergrads, when it comes to the issue of citing and plagiarism, because I think what many of us also take as an affront, oh, this is a slacker student trying to get one over on us, in reality is an entire generation of students who've grown up without a concept of intellectual property because of things like remixes and YouTube. So I think a low stakes way of teaching people how to write and cite, saying, we'll teach you how to do this instead of threatening you with academic dishonesty right out of the gate, I think is something we need to think about, particularly with some of our students who don't come from strong writing backgrounds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. And that's a great inclusive mindset and helping other colleagues to stop blaming students when it's really a generational difference.
Yeah, it's tough to explain it these days.
I do want to say something sort of in favor of the cookie cutter, not completely. Many students, especially really poorly prepared students from nowhere high schools, if you tell them directly, when you go to the library, you need to look at a very general study, something that covers maybe the whole 17th century if you're going to work on Milton, but then you also have to look at some specific material. Okay, read Comus and read a few articles about Comus or whatever, but read at more than one level. Do not read 4 different biographies of John Milton and expect to write a nice paper on Comus. The levels of interest and specificity, which the students are not necessarily at all aware of as significant, you need to address that issue for them. Otherwise, you can get 9 articles, only 3 moderately interesting on Comus, and a biography of Milton from the 1920s, and a paper that contains hardly any information and absolutely no insight, and a thesis that can't be sustained. And the kid really worked hard on it. So instruct the students carefully about what you can expect to find in library materials.
Great point. Let's move to scenario B. Love the conversation you had around scenario A. So let me read this one for you. The seminar style has 25 students. The syllabus states participation is worth 25% of the final grade, so it behooves you to speak up. About 80% of any discussion includes the same 6 to 7 volunteers and about 1 or 2 students who have never spoken up. And if we could peer into the future of this classroom, we'd see that a brilliant poet laureate is sitting in this class and often doesn't speak up. So the question is, how can this professor structure this class so there's more equitable participation and we don't miss out on the learning from any of the talent in the room, right? We really want to stress that diversity is a strength, and it's right there, but we don't always benefit from it if we don't tap into it. Viji, I can't see the chat window easily with everything going on my screen, so if you'll just manage that too. Did any group get a chance to talk about this?
Yeah, we talked about it a little bit in my group. We talked about using various mechanisms to randomize participation by calling on people, whether that's collecting 3x5 cards at the beginning with students' names on it, or using some kind of random name generator or whatever to divide the participation more equally. That's one of the strategies we talked about.
Great, thank you.
My group was also able to talk about this, and since my comment is directly related to what Ryan just said, I said that I have done that, where I say, okay, to kind of warn students that I'm going to cold call on them with these note cards, but I often find I'm too chicken to cold call because I am anticipating the anxiety they might be feeling, and so I'm afraid to cold call. But we talked about, in my group, we also talked about think, pair, share, giving that 1 minute, setting a timer, because I'm somebody who thinks it's a minute when it's been 30 seconds, because I'm like, oh, it's so quiet, everybody's getting freaked out. So doing that, letting them talk to classmates prior to sharing with the whole class to encourage, to make it feel safer and less anxiety provoking. So those were some things we talked about. So yeah.
Those are great.
Yeah.
And Amy, I'll add that I also was really chicken to do this random calling for a while. But it was evidence in the literature that really made me change my mind, because when we don't do it, the same people participate, and you often end up creating these stereotypes in classrooms that are more damaging. And so Viji and I talk about this all the time, but we both made an agreement that we wouldn't just call on a student unless they've had a chance to at least confer with each other first. Because a lot of the reasons why students don't like it is that they don't want to be wrong. That's a major reason why students don't participate. It doesn't cover every reason why students don't participate, but at least getting validation. And then what I usually say is, can you represent the group of students around you? Don't tell me what you think. Tell me what the group around you has just talked about. And it takes a little bit of that ownership off of that one student. And it really does make me feel better about it. My students, I do it routinely. Not everybody loves it, but I really don't get a lot of complaints about it. And I spend a bit of time with transparency around why I do that, and specifically why I'm trying to counteract stereotypes that can arise in a classroom. And I can even share the data with them, right? So I hear you, and there's an interesting paper out about all the instructors who want to do it and how they feel this anxiety about creating this safe space. So it's definitely, we're at odds with wanting to do that.
I think it's also true that students not only don't feel comfortable making comments, they also have a sense that most of their questions are stupid. And so you won't speak up with ideas. In fact, you're even afraid to speak up with the questions you managed to generate about the topic.
We discussed this also in Breakout Room 6.
A couple of people talked about having people draw numbers or using a random call list. We did discuss that it might cause anxiety. A lot of times we kept coming back to the idea of expanding what was meant by participation. So designating reporter, scribe, timekeeper, basically broadening all the different ways that people could be participating in the discussion without actually vocalizing. Poll everywhere type applications, as you've used in this session today, are used by some. We talked about the use of small group discussion leading to larger group discussion is helpful for some of us. And then alternative methods of presenting or speaking in class, doing so via text, YouTube videos recorded at home, etc.
That's a great summary. Yeah. And other groups have definitely talked upon that, some of those ideas and things Viji and I would have absolutely said too. So thank you.
I'll have to say that I wasn't in that group, but you know, I've served as department chair for over 15 years during the course of my career. And if a faculty member presented a syllabus that had 25% of the grade dependent on class participation, I would ask, what are your rubrics for determining that amount of participation? What are your rubrics and how are you keeping records of what students are contributing to the class? Because I think it's horrific.
Yeah, it leads to a lot of bias when there aren't metrics and measures, right? And it becomes very subjective about who you think participated. And so I agree, there need to be rubrics involved.
Although there are rubrics. I mean, you can find rubrics for this and you can create them that have some kind of measure of what it means to participate actively. And I also think, I understand what is being said, but often one of the things that I really want my students and residents to learn, I mean, I teach medical students, so it's a little bit different, but I actually think that the ability to present verbally is a skill that is important for them to develop. So sometimes I push back on that a little bit and push them to present, you know, because I think they need to know how to do that in order to kind of be functional. They need to communicate, although certainly giving them preparation and expectations really helps a lot too. Because I think presenting with rehearsal and preparation for some people is a lot easier than presenting off the cuff or speaking off the cuff.
Right.
I think there's got to be a place for vulnerability on the part of the instructor too, to encourage students to speak. Something that I do literally in my 100 level classes is every 17 minutes, based on a TED talk that I saw and loved, we stop the class and they have an opening to ask me a question literally about anything. They can ask me what I'm having for dinner tonight. They can ask me what I think about the material. They can ask me what my dog is up to, but they can ask me anything, and that indoctrinates them to. They've asked me some awkward questions too and really put me on the spot. And I've always managed to roll with it. And to teach them that you're vulnerable, that you're going to say stupid things once in a while, and that you don't have to be perfect with everything you say can be very empowering to them too. And I think the 2 minutes you might lose out of class time will be more than made up for if you have students who are willing to interact and be a part of the discussion later on.
That's a great point. It's something that, you know, I would encourage with caution for faculty members to think about, because not everyone can be equally vulnerable in a classroom setting. And we know that certain faculty identities, it's much more challenging to be that vulnerable, at least in an impromptu way with students. So may not be the best approach for everybody, but thinking about ways to be a human being with your students is absolutely something we should be striving for.
We thought we could finish up our time together, just showing you one way that we can structure the Q&A time a little bit more as well. And the way that we can do this is through Poll Everywhere. There's a feature called the Q&A, which has like an upvote function. So we would like to use this feature with Poll Everywhere. And now that we've discussed strategies for inclusive teaching, we'd like you to take about a minute to think and think about what we've discussed, formulate any questions, comments, and concerns that you may have. and thinking about the future of higher ed relative to inclusive teaching. And so once again, you can go to this QR code or polev.com/Carolina. And then you can put your own answer in, but you can also upvote if you like what somebody else has put there. You just click next to it. And in this way, we'll crowdsource some of the ideas that the majority of people might want to talk about a bit more. All right, so we've got a few things bubbling up. And we can see at the top of the list are the things that people have upvoted. So the first one here are the practices different in different disciplines, science versus humanities, for instance. I think the principles are the same, and structure can help all students and can disproportionately help some students more. I think it's a way that we can think about the diversity of students of the future and think about helping all students. I think some of the differences between science and humanities are probably, and Viji, jump in at any point, are probably about some of the assessments. So in the sciences, we tend to be more exam heavy, and a low structure class there might be 1 or 2 high stakes exams and a final and like nothing else as part of their grade, or very little as part of their grade. So maybe not a lot of opportunities to practice scientific thinking, and can sometimes be a lot of regurgitation. So moving towards conceptual thinking and practice being a scientist. But I think that that rings true in humanities too, as well. Social sciences, making sure it's not all about memorizing dates, and to make sure students are thinking like the disciplinary experts, things like that. Does anybody else want to jump in? Viji, did you have anything you want to add here, or anybody else?
No, I was just going to say, I think, you know, when we think about good teaching, we think about backwards design. What is it that you intend for your students to be able to do or demonstrate at the end of the semester? And so alignment to those principles throughout the semester, where you're building up to that, is really the key part of it. It's great to be able to have high standards for our students, but it's also important to be able to help them meet those standards throughout the course of the semester.
So it looks like a concern some folks have had is a lack of public support for the benefits of education. We're not going to solve that one today, are we? What sorts of inclusive teaching techniques can be culturally responsive? How do we recognize and value cultural communication differences?
Differences, I can see it on my phone, in the process of inclusive teaching. This is one where I think it came up early, actually, in our conversation about challenges, that there, especially in a larger classroom, there are more students, and so more diversity might be more possible in a bigger classroom. So how do we differentiate? How do we support different students? And this is one where I think it's really important to understand who your students are, even if it's just a snapshot, being able to chat with your students. And I use a survey feature before I meet my students. I ask them to complete a few questions. And one of the questions I ask them is actually about what makes them feel included in a classroom setting or a course setting. And it's helpful for me to see their responses and to be able to plan a course in a way that feels like it can support them in their learning process. So I encourage you to think about just asking them before you even get started about what's important to them, how you might be able to support their learning best. It doesn't mean you could accommodate everyone, but it's sometimes you'll see the ask seems very simple and very easy to do. And I've over the years adapted and developed things that all started because a student asked for it initially, and it became a staple of the course. So that's a really easy way to just talk to them and figure out what's helpful.
So this other concern is about screen fatigue, especially as we come up into this next year with asynchronous learning. I think that is a big concern, and I think I would lean on the literature around universal design of learning. And the idea is that if there's one way that students can complete something, is there maybe another way that students can do it as well? So if the goal is to provide a non-screen option, perhaps there are ways that we could do more podcast or audio-based types of things that students could be out for a run or dealing with their kids while they're also listening to something, right? As opposed to being on a screen. And the idea of universal design for learning, in case you're not that familiar with it, it's based on architecture. So if you think about getting into a building, there might be steps to get in, right? But there's always an alternative way for people who can't access steps, and those would be ramps, right? So somebody in a wheelchair or somebody with a stroller with kids, that ramp doesn't inhibit the other folks from getting into that building, right? It's just an alternative to options for accessing the same building. And so I would lean on that to think about if there's an alternative way to provide students the goals that you're trying to reach that might lean away from screens. Do you want to take this one? I can't see the whole thing.
Let me find it on my, okay, here we go. How do we plan for situations where the needs of some students are in conflict with the needs of others? E.g., some need more time and practice, others want to move ahead. This is one of, this one's near and dear to me as a person who teaches a quantitative course, because there is varying speed at which people understand the material and move through it. So this is where I think online shines, because you can provide materials to your students. They can decide at which pace they want to consume that information. They can hit pause, they can replay, and then you can ask questions. It's always been my mantra with my students that it's never about how fast you get to the answer. It's really just about the quality of the work. And so you get to live that in this sort of asynchronous way with your students. So I think that universal design for learning and thinking about what are the multiple ways in which I can make sure my students feel comfortable with the material is available to them, but requiring some core set of materials that allows me to see how comfortable my students are at a snapshot with the material is also helpful. So over time, you might have a bank of exercises that students who need that extra work can use, but there is some core set that you expect all students to engage with to help you understand where they are. We're coming close to the end of our time here. We want to thank you on this lovely summer day, wherever you are, for being part of this conversation, for contributing to your group's discussion, to invite you to continue the discussion with us if you are on Twitter, or just contact us in any way that you would like. But just to be able to take a moment to think about our practice as educators, I really sincerely appreciate the time that you've put in today.
Yes, thank you. It was great to meet you all virtually.